There's a pattern in history that has toppled three major governments in the last 250 years. And right now in 2025, the United States is following that exact same pattern stage by stage, grievance by grievance. In 1789, France was the most powerful nation in Europe. Wealthy, cultured, advanced, and within 5 years, the government was overthrown. The king was beheaded and the country descended into the terror where 40,000 people were executed for political crimes. In 1917, Russia was a vast empire. Tsar ruled 180 million people. The military had just fought in World War I, and in 8 months, the entire regime collapsed. The Bolsheviks took power and 20 million would die in the civil war and purges that followed. In 1959, Cuba was a prosperous Caribbean nation. American tourists, casinos, a functioning economy. And in 2 years, Fidel Castro overthrew the government, nationalized everything, and turned the country into a communist dictatorship that lasted 60 years. 3 times, 3 revolutions, 3 moments when a seemingly stable government collapsed into chaos. And every time the people in power never saw it coming. They thought they were untouchable. They thought the peasants would never rise. They thought the system was too strong to fall. They were wrong every single time. And right now, every warning sign that preceded those 3 revolutions is present in the United States. The wealth inequality, the government corruption, the loss of faith in institutions, the rage building beneath the surface. We're not heading toward the pattern. We're in stage 4. And history says stage 5 and 6 come fast. This is the story of how revolutions happen, why governments never see them coming, and why the math says we're next. Before we go through the pattern, you need to understand what a revolution actually is. Not a protest, not a riot, not political change. A revolution is when the existing order is completely destroyed and replaced with something new, often something worse. Revolutions don't happen because people are poor. Poverty has existed for all of human history. Revolutions happen when expectations exceed reality, when people believe they deserve better than what they have. When the gap between the elites and everyone else becomes so extreme that the social contract breaks. And most importantly, when people lose faith that the system can fix itself. That the government, the courts, the elections, any of it will address their grievances. When peaceful reform becomes impossible, violent revolution becomes inevitable. That's not radical theory. That's John F. Kennedy's exact words. Those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable. And history proves it every single time. France, Russia, Cuba. 3 different centuries, 3 different ideologies, but the exact same 6-stage sequence. Let's look at how it actually played out. Let's start with the mother of all modern revolutions, France. 1789. In the 1780s, France was the center of European civilization. Paris was the cultural capital of the world. French was the language of diplomacy, the arts, philosophy, science, all flourishing. King Louis XVI sat on the throne. The monarchy had ruled France for 800 years. It seemed eternal, unshakable. But beneath the surface, the rot was total. This is stage 1 of every revolution. Extreme wealth inequality. In 1789, France had 27 million people divided into 3 estates. The first estate, the clergy, owned 10% of the land and paid no taxes. The second estate, the nobility, about 400,000 people, owned 25% of the land and paid almost no taxes. The third estate, everyone else, 26 million peasants, workers, and middle class, owned 65% of the land and paid all the taxes. Let that sink in. 1.5% of the population paid no taxes, while 98.5% carried the entire burden. And it wasn't just taxes. The nobility had privileges. They could hunt on peasant land. They could demand labor. They lived in palaces while peasants starved. By 1788, a bad harvest caused bread prices to spike. Bread was 88% of a peasant's budget. When prices doubled, people couldn't eat. But the nobility, still eating 5-course meals, still throwing lavish parties at Versailles. The gap between the rich and everyone else wasn't just economic. It was a complete disconnect from reality. This is stage 2 government corruption and incompetence. King Louis XVI was not evil. He was weak and indecisive. France was bankrupt from fighting wars, including helping America in the Revolutionary War. The government owed billions. And Louis' solution? borrow more, raise taxes on the peasants, cut nothing. The nobility refused to pay taxes. The clergy refused. And when Louis tried to reform, they blocked him because the people with power would rather see the country burn than give up their privileges. Sound familiar? By 1789, France was in crisis. The government couldn't pay its debts. The people couldn't afford food. And Louis called the Estates General, a representative assembly that hadn't met in 175 years. He thought it would legitimize new taxes. Instead, it became the spark. This is stage 3. Middle class destroyed and radicalized. The Third Estate, which included not just peasants, but also lawyers, merchants, and educated middle class, demanded equal representation. They wanted 1 vote per person, not 1 vote per estate, which gave the nobility and clergy a 2-to-1 advantage. They wanted 1 vote per person, not 1 vote per estate, which gave the nobility and clergy a 2-to-1 advantage. Louis refused. So on June 17, 1789, the Third Estate declared itself the National Assembly. They locked themselves in a tennis court and vowed not to leave until France had a constitution. This is the moment when the middle class, the educated people who should be supporting the system, turn against it. When lawyers and merchants say the government is illegitimate, that's when revolution becomes inevitable. July 14, 1789, Parisians stormed the Bastille prison, a symbol of royal authority. They killed the guards, paraded their heads on pikes through the streets. The revolution had begun and it escalated fast. This is stage 4, loss of faith in institutions. The monarchy, the church, the courts all lost legitimacy. The National Assembly abolished feudalism, seized church lands, declared the rights of man. But it wasn't enough. The radicals kept pushing. Stage 5. Revolutionary movement gains mass support. The Jacobins, led by Robespierre, demanded more extreme measures. They wanted to execute the king, redistribute all wealth, purge the enemies of the revolution, and they gained popular support because the moderates had failed to deliver. The economy was still in crisis, food was still scarce, and people wanted blood. January 21, 1793, King Louis XVI was beheaded by guillotine in public. His wife, Maria Antoinette, followed in October, and then the terror began. Stage 6. Government overthrown. Chaos follows. From 1793 to 1794, the Committee of Public Safety, led by Robespierre, executed 40,000 people. Nobles, priests, political opponents, even fellow revolutionaries who weren't radical enough. They called it purifying the revolution. It was mass murder. The guillotine ran daily in Paris, public executions as entertainment, and the purge kept expanding. First the nobility, then the moderate revolutionaries, then anyone accused of counter-revolutionary thoughts. No trial, no evidence, just accusation and death. Robespierre himself was eventually executed by the same system he created because revolutions devour their own children always. By 1799, France was exhausted. 10 years of chaos, economic collapse, war on all fronts, and Napoleon seized power in a coup, became emperor. The revolution that began with liberty, equality, fraternity ended with a military dictatorship that would drag Europe into 15 years of war. The lesson of France. Extreme inequality plus government incompetence plus loss of faith in institutions leads to revolution. And revolution leads to chaos, terror, and often dictatorship worse than what came before. Now let's jump forward 128 years. Russia 1917. By 1917, Russia was a backwards empire ruled by Tsar Nicholas II. The Romanov dynasty had ruled for 300 years. And Russia was massive, 180 million people spanning from Europe to the Pacific. But beneath the imperial facade, the same rot. Stage 1. Extreme wealth inequality. The Tsar nobility owned everything. The peasants, 80% of the population, owned nothing. They'd been freed from serfdom in 1861, but most still worked land owned by nobles, paying rent they couldn't afford. In the cities, factory workers labored 12-14 hours a day for starvation wages. Child labor was common. Safety regulations didn't exist. Meanwhile, the Tsar lived in palaces. The nobility hosted balls that cost more than a peasant would earn in a lifetime. The gap wasn't just economic. It was feudal, medieval, and unsustainable. Stage 2. Government corruption and incompetence. Tsar Nicholas II was a disaster. Weak, indecisive, and completely out of touch with reality. He believed in divine right that God had chosen him to rule, and therefore no reform was necessary. When workers peacefully marched to the Winter Palace in 1905 to petition for better conditions, his guards opened fire, hundreds killed. Bloody Sunday? It destroyed any remaining faith that Tsar cared about his people. Then came World War I. Russia entered in 1914, and it was a catastrophe. Millions of poorly equipped soldiers sent to die. Officers were incompetent. Supply lines collapsed. Soldiers fought without bullets. Entire divisions surrendered because they had no ammunition. By 1917, Russia had suffered 3 million casualties. The army was deserting, the economy was collapsing. And the Tsar still living in luxury, still making decisions based on advice from Rasputin, a mystical holy man who had influence over the arena. February 1917, bread riots in Petrograd, St. Petersburg. Women in bread lines started protesting. Workers joined them. The army was called in to restore order, but the soldiers refused to fire on the crowds. They mutinied. Stage 3, middle class and military turn against the government. When the army won't defend you, the government is over. The Duma, Russia's parliament, demanded Nicholas abdicate, and on March 15, 1917, he did. After 300 years, the Romanov dynasty ended not with a war, but with a whimper. A provisional government took over led by Alexander Kerensky. They promised reforms, elections, a constitution. But they made a fatal mistake. They kept Russia in World War I. The soldiers wanted peace, the people wanted food. And the provisional government delivered neither. Stage 4, loss of faith in institutions. The provisional government lost legitimacy within months. They were seen as weak, incompetent, beholden to foreign powers. And into that vacuum stepped Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks. Stage 5, revolutionary movement gains mass support. Lenin promised 3 things: peace, land, bread. End the war. Redistribute the nobility's land to peasants. Feed the people. Simple, direct. And the Bolsheviks built a disciplined revolutionary organization ready to seize power. October 25, 1917, the Bolsheviks launched a coup. They stormed the Winter Palace, arrested the provisional government, and Lenin declared Soviet power. The whole operation took less than 24 hours, almost bloodless, but what followed wasn't. Stage 6, government overthrown. Chaos follows. The Russian Civil War lasted from 1918 to 1922. The Reds, Bolsheviks versus the Whites, everyone else. Monarchists, liberals, foreign intervention. It was total war. And the Bolsheviks won through ruthless terror. The Cheka, the secret police, executed anyone suspected of counter-revolutionary activity. Entire villages wiped out. In July 1918, the Tsar and his entire family were executed in a basement, shot and bayoneted, even the children. By 1922, the Bolsheviks controlled Russia, but the cost was catastrophic. 10 million dead in the Civil War. Famine killed millions more. The economy was destroyed. In Lenin's promises, peace meant surrender to Germany in humiliating terms. Land meant collectivization and famine. Bread meant rationing and starvation. The revolution that promised liberation delivered dictatorship. Stalin would take over in 1924 and kill 20 million more in purges and famines. The lesson of Russia. When government incompetence meets military defeat meets revolutionary organization, the entire system can collapse in months, and what replaces it is often far worse. Now let's look at the most recent example, Cuba, 1959. This one is different because Cuba wasn't a backwards peasant society. It was a relatively prosperous country in the 1950s. Cuba had one of the highest standards of living in Latin America. Havana was called the Monte Carlo of the Caribbean. Tourism, casinos, American investment. But beneath the glamour, the same pattern. Stage 1, extreme wealth inequality. The wealth was concentrated in Havana and among elites connected to President Fulgencio Batista's regime. The rural poor, especially in eastern Cuba, lived in poverty. Sugar plantations dominated the economy. American companies owned much of the land. The profits flowed out of the country or into the pockets of a small elite. Meanwhile, rural Cubans had no health care, no education, no opportunity. The gap between Havana's nightclubs and the rural countryside was enormous. Stage 2, government corruption and incompetence. Batista was a dictator who seized power in a 1952 coup. He cancelled elections, ruled by decree, and the corruption was total. police could be bought, courts were rigged. Political opponents were imprisoned or killed. American mobsters ran the casinos with Batista's blessing, paying him a cut. The government existed to enrich Batista and his cronies, nothing else. And when people protested, the response was violence, secret police, torture, disappearances. This created rage, especially among young, educated Cubans who saw their country being looted. Stage 3, middle class radicalized. Fidel Castro was a lawyer from a relatively wealthy family. Educated. He could have been part of the elite. But he saw the corruption and chose revolution. In 1953, he led an attack on the Moncada barracks. It failed,